really, we're going to be talking about the largest foundations, but a lot of what we'll discuss today applies to your organization in terms of its own aspirational grants. So many of these lessons will be transferable to that as well. If we don't touch on your particular circumstance, there'll be a little time for Q&A at the end, and I'm happy to stay after, and we'll be here throughout the day if you want to talk further. So let me ask you first, how many of you have attempted to secure funding from what you consider in your capacity an aspirational funder? That would be almost everyone. And just by means of a little word association, what was your experience in doing that? How would you describe it? Bewildering. Good one. Daunting. What was that? Overwhelming. Painful. Time-consuming, that's for sure. What was that one? Soul-crushing. Oh. I'm not sure I can help you with that one today, but, we can get some free therapy together, I think, for everybody. Yes, I think those adjectives describe what most of us have felt at least at one point or another. And look, I'm not promising that we're going to have any magic recipes that are going to allow you to secure a grant, but I will say there are lots of patterns that I've seen that make life even more difficult. And because we all have so much on our plates, when you add one of these aspirational funders to the mix, it only makes things a little more daunting and, dare we say, soul-crushing when you have to fit it into everything else you're doing. So I hope you can walk away today with some practical ideas for what you might do to make the process a little easier on yourself and your organization. Sound good? Okay, so I thought we would make this a little fun and in a game show kind of format today. And we will, forgive me, I'm not able to move much from this position today, so whereas I'd like to be more interactive. Let's start with a little bit of a game show. And anyone know the match game? Whether you know it from the 70s or last year, you don't have to tell us, date yourself. But let's start out with a few of these cliches in our field that tend to define some of the work we do. So you might have seen, okay, so here's our match game, but oh, by the way, it is a branded GPA edition. Okay, so the first question we will be, if you're not familiar with this game, it's a pretty simple fill in the blanks. So if you've seen one foundation, you've seen one foundation, exactly. And I think that is going to really define, as it always does, what we talk about today. We'll be talking about the majority, but there are exceptions to everything. So this next one comes from board members mostly. You might hear it a little less as a grants professional, but I have a feeling you've overheard it for someone like a board member addressing Mary, major gift officer, and she might say something like, why don't we ask for a major gift from Bill Gates or we're talking major donors. Yes, Oprah, that's it. That's the one I hear most often. Bill Gates, he's moved on a little bit to the foundation side, I'd say. So for the people like us, when we are securing grants, then it is Gary, grant professional. Here's what we need from you. What we really need is a grant from the Gates Foundation. Although I will say, especially maybe more so because I'm a consultant and I'm hearing the variety of organizations, I hear it just as much. We need a grant from Robert Wood Johnson or Ford or Kellogg. Arnold is a new biggie. Walton family, MacArthur, we can go on and on. But this might sound familiar. Do you work at an organization that has its eye on a prize? Yeah, they often do. And there's nothing, not that there's anything wrong with that. It is something that sometimes is the right direction to take, but we want to make sure that we're doing this for the right reason. And in particular, we all know the feeling that if those around us on the board or in leadership want to secure a particular grant, and it's possible that the organization is not ready. So I hope that what we will also do today is get you to a point where if you are looking to secure a grant from one of these aspirational funders, or one that might be aspirational in your sphere, that there are some realistic steps that you can take so that you're not spending 50 hours on a proposal for which you are not yet ready, and therefore maybe you avoid the soul-crushingness of this field. Okay. So what are we talking about exactly in these types of foundations? Real quickly, oh, there was one more. Okay. So real quickly, what I'm going to refer to as national funders, there's no particular definition here, but mostly these are staffed foundations. You know probably that 90% of foundations are not. So we're already talking about a small piece of the pie. They have a wide geographic interest, and that could mean they do place-based funding in various areas, or they do widespread national funding. They are capable of organizational changing awards. And that's why I'm saying, even if you work for a smaller organization, these might be changing the kind of work you do. They are capable of those awards, even if you're not asking them for that kind of award. But this is the realm in which we're talking. And they are competitive. We all know that. There's the soul-crushingness right there. But they're getting increasingly competitive, and it's important for all of us to know that this competitiveness is not exclusively merit-based. So, there are so many factors, many of which we will talk about today, that lead to the acceptance of these grant proposals, and really and truly the merit is an important piece of the pie, but not the only piece of the pie. So I hope to get at ways in which you present yourself that will allow you to be competitive. The typical purposes for many of these national funders, look, they are wanting to make a big change with their limited investment. So it's a huge grant to us, but they know it's a limited investment that they have to make as big a change as they think they can make. So they try to do it increasingly through research, advocacy, program growth and innovation, and then they try to focus on social issues that will have a widespread ability to change the landscape that they are trying to change. This is not an exclusive list, but the trends in these directions are pretty strong. You've probably seen them yourselves. So with that, it's important to say that as we continue on our match game here, as we hire people in our departments to do grants, the skill sets we're looking for need to adhere to the current trends. So as you usually, or think about when you were hired, the number one skill that many who do the hiring look for in grants professionals tends to be what? Writing. I think that is usually the case. Is that still the case in your department? Often. Now, I will say, in order to successfully solicit, especially some of these largest funders, I think that is a once upon a time, right? Writing is important, but I don't know about you, in pretty much every job I see in the fundraising sector, writing is pretty important all around. So writing as the core skill really cannot be the standard bearer anymore. There are far too many pieces that have to lead up to that stellar proposal, right? We could be sitting at our desks and typing with that clawed hand we heard about last hour, and the best proposals may not get the attention they need. So along those lines, what is the first thing that typical grant seekers focus on, let's say after the research, when they are submitting a proposal? What's the first thing you do after you've done the research and identified? Content? Contacts, yes. Relationship building, excellent. And I heard someone say what I think still is sometimes the case, which is beginning an LOI with the program information. And I think maybe not for those of us in this room, but certainly from a management standpoint, it still really is about the writing, whether it is a proposal or something longer in terms of the proposal itself. So I think what we need to help our supervisors, our colleagues understand is that the process of the writing really needs to be a decrease in the time spent on it and an increase in the pieces that we'll talk about today. So, as we look at the top 10 things that these large funders tend to look at, we've picked out 6 of the most obvious. And then we'll talk about 4 in more depth in kind of a case study format so we can really dig in. It shouldn't surprise most of you that many of these pieces that you'll see on this slide are from the proposals, right? Because funders really do focus on primarily alignment, right? If they detect right away that you don't meet their criteria, it is the virtual circular file for you. You all know that. But that really is true. The next few, if we go in kind of a clockwise format here, are just as important. We did hear also already this morning about impact and outcomes, all of our favorite topics to talk about. We won't get into these in depth, but there are terrific sessions throughout the rest of the conference if you want to learn more about each of these. But essentially, results. Short-term, long-term results are clearly important to these funders who are looking to make a difference. And then the budget. For me, this is something we never spend enough time on. How many of you do the budget last and we're always squeezing it in right before the deadline and putting the numbers together? You know, maybe it's because most of us were hired as writers and we're trying to avoid the numbers. But I'll tell you, I think it makes a tremendous difference if you haven't tried the strategy to do the budget first. Anyone in here that really dedicated to that? Great. The budget to me, especially with these online applications, it is almost its own narrative. Do you agree? Those of you who do it first probably agree. To me, with an online format especially that's pretty truncated, that narrative becomes somewhat of a set of footnotes to the budget if you look at it a certain way, right? So you should really be able to see priorities in that budget, what is happening, and grant makers focus on that. Okay, leadership. I know that these proposals ask for information about your leaders. But if you can come to another level in describing that, not just the bios, cut and paste, but you can cut and paste something else that you put together. What makes your leadership special? Is it that they have an average of a 12-year tenure at your organization? Is it that they all, as a group, attend a particular training that is impressive and provides certification in your field? How can you make, and this doesn't have to be the executive leadership, it could be the group that's running the initiative you're looking for funding for, but how can you elevate those leaders out from, let's face it, a tremendous amount of reading that these funders need to do? Any of you who was working in the pre-online application age and ever went into the office of a program officer at one of these big funders, did you ever get to see the pile of proposals? I mean, it could be 3 or 4 feet high. And now they're reading the virtual equivalent of that and more. And let's face it, it's not fun. So to give them something they can really delve into, and not just our CEO went to this college and has won these awards, but something meaty about the leadership is great. And finally, on our obvious list is the preparation that we all do and help our colleagues do for the meetings, for the phone calls, and obviously for putting the proposal together. I'll just say anecdotally, I've worked with a lot of groups where we've spent a lot of time thinking about phone calls and meetings with funders once you get them. And even, I'm a big believer in talking points. And then the meeting happens, and it's like it all goes out the window. So the idea of really focusing in those very important in-person or phone-based meetings, questions for about 50% of the meeting, I think is really the road to success. And then being able in real time to respond to those questions in a way that's meaningful to the funder. And I'll give you one of our case studies in a few minutes. We'll talk about, well, what happens if we don't have something meaningful for the funder? There is hope for you too. So anyway, these to me are the pieces that we hear about the most, that you can find a lot of information about at the conference, but deserve some attention today. So now we will talk about some of the pieces that you might think about a little less, or more likely you focus on, but maybe not in a way that's as efficient as you could. So it seems like the theme of the day is about efficiency. Let's not waste our time. Let's use our resources to the best that we can. Okay, so the first conundrum that I run into all the time, did on staff, and certainly do with my clients, is what if our organization lacks credibility? And so this is a relative term, right? Let's acknowledge that. Your organization could have an enormous amount of credibility in your local area or in a niche in your field, but when you get to the level of let's say a Gates Foundation or a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation these days, there are 1.5 million nonprofits. So it's a different level of credibility. Sometimes you've got to build that. So let's talk about some examples of how that can happen. How will we do it? How about a game show format? Okay, now it is time for the Masked Singer GPA edition. Okay, I've got a little disclaimer. I did not watch one episode of The Masked Singer, so anything that you see or hear related to that show is completely not meant to be symbolic or really related to the show, but just fun. Okay, so you can help fill me in if there's anything good that I'm missing in the way of a joke there as we go. So back to our question, what if our organization lacks credibility? We're going to talk about that, and typically when I do these case studies, I'm only picking out examples that I've seen repeatedly. We don't want any outliers here. We want them to be broadly applicable. So I want this to be something that you can all relate to, and we're going to therefore mask the identity of the nonprofit I'm speaking of, but I'll say that I've seen this exact example multiple times. Who better to represent something that lacks credibility than this guy who, as best I can tell, is wearing a fried egg on his head? Am I wrong about that? I don't know. So to me, this is someone who lacks credibility. I'm not saying your nonprofit does inherently, but in terms of these big funders, they may not have, there could be 100 of these, we'll call them Egberts, out there. So I'll give you the example of, in this case, let's start, I want to try to touch on as many nonprofit types as possible so you can find a connection to at least one of these examples. In this case, it was a small grassroots nonprofit, although for grassroots, mid-size. It had about a $500,000 budget. And the largest grant it had received was about $35,000. But this organization was determined to secure large grants and do its work on a national level. That's a big leap, right? And not every organization, including this one at the time, was ready for that. So there's got to be some honesty in that conversation first, before we get to all of those adjectives we described earlier about the soullessness and all the rest of it. We need to make sure we're being honest with ourselves. And so for me, there are two ways, among others, two ways in our specific field to build credibility. One is to get foundation grants in the first place, right? You could work your way up with increasingly known funders and get to the point where you're at a Robert Wood Johnson, for instance. Or there's another way to do it where if you feel like it's a catch-22, well, look, I'm just stuck at this particular level in my grant seeking. I can't get outside of the small regional grants in my area. How do I break through? Has anyone been to that point where I just can't break through to the next level? Yeah, it happens inevitably at some point. Another way to do it is what this group did. And what we did was retooled a little bit to figure out how can we get some credibility knowing that there are only limited funders in our local or regional area that are going to fund our work. And this was in criminal justice before criminal justice was a somewhat more hot button issue as it is now. So there were not a lot of funders in that space. And what this group did was we decided that in parallel to its current grant-seeking efforts, they really were going to build a resume. So if we needed to build an organizational resume that would appeal to some of these larger funders, what is it that we need to add to that resume? And it was two things we decided. It was more media and awards. And you probably all know that we live in a world now with a lot of awards. Some of them even come with cash prizes, so maybe even better than grants. They're unrestricted. Some of them were even $40,000, which were larger than this group had ever raised in a single grant. So the idea here was twofold. Number one, we are building that resume. So in the same way we described a minute ago, the way you can describe your leadership in terms of a solid package where you solidify, here's what's amazing about our leadership. It can be very impressive to have these kind of credentials for awards that are given first probably in your local area and then regional, and then you work your way up from there. This local group got 3 or 4 very prestigious national awards, and you're able to tout that. Well, you might say, we've been featured 3 or 4 times in our local paper, and it's so easy, very understandable because I've been there too. You get these media hits, and it's easy to think, okay, this is the rainmaker. We're on the front page of the paper, or we've won this great award. This is it. Everyone will pay attention to us now. And what we've learned in doing this as we're building credibility for foundations is that it's really about making sure that those media mentions and those awards never go away. In the same way, think of your own resume. Outside of maybe your earliest jobs, everything else stays there, right? And so what a lot of organizations do, in my experience, is they get some of these terrific opportunities to tout the fact that they've been vetted and selected by an outside organization, and then they send out the press release or an e-blast, and then it's kind of gone. Is that your experience too? So the idea would be, keep it front and center so that you keep mentioning it. We are the award-winning ABC nonprofit. And then pretty high up in your description, take out some of that history and talk about these awards. That is your current self, right? You're not going to talk so much in your resume about where you were born, but you're going to talk about what you've done most recently. And that, to me, is what starts getting the attention of these big funders when you can't get it from other funders in that at that stratosphere that you're looking at. It helps you break through to be able to keep reminding them up front in a loud way, this is what we've done. It's big, it's bold, we are going places, we need you to come with us. And have it all over your website, those awards, the media mentions, everything else that you can garner for your organization and continue to promote that side of your organization. So this group that is part of our case study, as we went along, they did a tremendous job. I think they had a running tab with their with the logos of the papers and the awards that they ran. It was very prominent on their website and on anything online that they did. It made it into every proposal and was quite prominent. We made heartbreaking decisions to take out some other juicy information that we thought was juicy but really wasn't serving us well anymore. And sure enough, started getting funding, so the $35,000 max grant, went to 50 from a local funder, went to 100, went to 100 from a national funder, one whose names you would all know, and then became a 300,000 from a national funder and went on from there. So I really am convinced that it is a breakthrough that takes time, yes, but can be well worth it. And even just that idea of dredging up, what else have we already done even that we might have buried in our press releases on the website? Yes.
I have a quick question about kind of making your own luck in that respect.
Yes.
One of the things I'm thinking about is positioning yourself as a subject matter expert. Things like blog content, SEO optimized type of content that can, even if you are a local foundation or a local nonprofit doing local work, getting nationally known as a leader in it. Have you had experience with that? Is that something that you found to be effective?
Yes, I can't say that I know it to be effective with the same repetitiveness as this media and award piece, but certainly anything you can do to break through and distinguish yourself as someone doing something different, particularly if it is national, gaining national attention, it is absolutely a strategy that you can utilize. So absolutely, I'd say it sounds promising, although I can't say I've seen it repeated multiple times, so I don't want to make those promises. But I really think that if you huddle with the people who really have institutional history, you can probably pull out some of these pieces alone. Okay, so what are the lessons learned from that whole piece? I'd say awards are awesome. Media can be magical. And promotion propels. So none of that means much unless you're going to constantly promote the things that have worked well for you in perpetuity almost. I mean, you really need to keep touting them. And that's not something nonprofits often do well, but we really need to do that. Think of it as building a resume. And you can literally build a nonprofit resume if you need to keep all of these things top of mind. Okay, grant seeker conundrum number 2. What if we have poor rapport with a funder? A lot of you mentioned rapport as a thing that you spend a lot of time on. Who finds this a regular barrier to securing grants? And not, it's worth saying that poor rapport can mean 2 things, right? Not a good relationship or just not a relationship at all, right? So I have to admit, I have run into a lot of organizations that think, gee, I cannot apply to such and such funder because so-and-so in our office has a really bad relationship with somebody there. Do any of you run into that barrier? You do. We can talk about that one too if you'd like. I thought it would be more interesting and more applicable to talk about not having a relationship, but there are a lot of nods to that. We can get back to that, or happy to have a little coffee clatch around that particular issue later if you want. It is something you can overcome. But I think more people probably feel like, how do you overcome that initial hurdle if you don't have a relationship? Is that something that you struggle with on these large funders? Okay, so here's a very real example of how one organization did it, and I have seen this work repeatedly. It takes tenacity, right? I think that not unlike the media example we just gave, where there's kind of one hit in terms of a great media post or mention, and then we tend to forget about it. Sometimes I think that tends to happen also on the foundation front. And the reason that happens is we feel we call these program officers, and oh, drat, they have not returned my call. And then we move on to the next thing. And we just say, well, I guess they're not going to reach out to me. I'll submit that LOI, right? And that's, again, completely understandable because it is such a time-consuming phenomenon and one that is outside of the typical tools we are provided as grant professionals, I think. Major gifts officers have their moves management and all of that. I think there's a session today about moves management in this field, but increasingly, I think it's a real thing, right? We need to keep tabs on what we're doing with those relationships. How many months do they say is the average it takes to go from meeting a donor until the point at which they will provide a major gift to your organization? Usually it's about 18 months on average that people will say, right? So the idea of making a phone call and then saying, gosh darn, they're not going to call me back, is playing on the same kind of human response that we would expect from a potential major donor. So I'd say if you really want to play with some of these big funders, give yourself 18 months to develop that relationship. And it can happen in much less time. It can take even more time. But here's one way it can work, and I have seen this repeatedly. So a mid-sized organization I know that has mid-level, I'd say, credibility, just because we're talking about that term. So they're not the Red Cross where the funder would recognize them right away, but they had some cachet in their space. But wanted to get to that next level in grants and not getting responses from anybody. And so we started figuring out, okay, what kind of routine can you be on in terms of reaching out to these people? And here is essentially the pattern that I tend to suggest to folks, which is that when you make that first phone call, it can be brief. It is best if it is preceded by a very brief email. And that very brief email should have a sentence or two that, yes, you can use repeatedly, but should really bring out the best in your organization. Again, if you are award-winning in whatever realm, great, say that. If you have achieved some things that do distinguish you, even in terms of the credentials that were just mentioned here, something that makes you stand out, just a couple sentences, and the alignment that you see between that funder and your organization. So very brief email saying that at the end, and I will plan to call you in the coming days to see if we can continue this conversation. So this client of mine, oh, and I forgot my little Flo, as I've called her, who is, clearly relationship challenged, right? Looks a little awkward. So we'll call her Flo. And so Flo would send out these messages and then contact the foundation a few days later and leave a very brief message. This is Flo from ABC Nonprofit. I sent you a little note. I really feel strongly that our organizations have some synergy. I'd love to spend 15, 20 minutes exploring that with you. Well, do you think the program officer responded? No, that is correct. So, but we kind of expected that. It's a big foundation. They've got lots of people coming in. So what Flo did is wait a few, I think it was a few months, 2 to 3 months, and then sent another message. Still relatively brief, but a bit longer, more detail-oriented, only a couple paragraphs, but really dug into the meat of that alignment between her nonprofit and the funder. Not an ask, not even a pitch for a specific program, but really just a really good case for support in very brief form. So if your organization writes a case for support, I hope you have that very truncated, most powerful case for support. That's kind of what went into this package. And so we sent that again to the program officer and then said, I'd love to talk. And at that point, lo and behold, we got a phone call. So the phone call discussed alignment, discussed priorities. We were very prepared with talking points and the whole bit. And do you think it moved forward to a letter of intent from there? No, it did not. It was, the good part of this exchange was that it was a very honest conversation. And it was a conversation that allowed Flo, poor Flo, who's already overflowing in grant applications, to have one less thing to do at that moment. But what we decided at that point is what really needs to happen, I think, increasingly in our field is to figure out a moves management type process where there were quarterly touch points with this foundation, and we set it up for that expectation to say, okay, program officer, I hear you. We have this alignment, yes, but the nuances are not quite there at the moment. And the program officer agreed with that. So we proposed, do you mind if we touch base with you periodically to let you know as things develop? You know, we all know this next phase, right? But we were very overt about it. And the program officer said, sure. So I think at that point, you get to the middle ground where you don't want to pester the poor program officer and yet don't want to completely forget about the program officer. And in my experience, the latter is more common, right? You move on to other things. But it is really important to find brief ways to connect in a very succinct, and the emphasis is on succinct, manner with these foundation staffers. So Flo contacted the program officer 1, 2, 3, maybe 4 times, approximately quarterly, when something of interest happened. Now, did we have to think hard a couple times about, what's happening this quarter? Yes, we did. But usually there was something that if we just really put our head to it, it was worthwhile. It didn't take long, and it allowed us to keep moving. In those 3 or 4 quarters, did we hear anything from the program officer proactively? No, we did not. However, it is worth the effort because now she was putting an email address to a voice, which became a video call, so there was a face in there, and then these additional messages that were very brief but also very tailored to what we heard her say. This wasn't just our boasting, it was very tailored. And then we got to the point where there was some movement in the organization's next year plans that aligned with something we had heard from the program officer. So we were able to say, okay, we're ready for the phone call now, and had another phone call, at which point not only, and this is where this whole process really comes together beautifully, not only did the program officer say, great, we're ready to hear from you, she felt like she knew Flo, and she knew the organization, and appreciated the time and care that was taken to cultivate her, and even said that she didn't see it very often. So the proposal came with all the bells and whistles we always hope for, which is that the program officer gave us talking points, said she would review the document before it went to the formal application deadline, and all the things we all hope for. It got lots of feedback from her, and it was all very helpful. And so that was a $250,000 award from a national foundation that also led to contacts at other national foundations and a subsequent grant. So again, nothing there is revolutionary, but I think the diligence in making sure that we act as our major gift peers do and make sure that we're paying attention to those relationships in some detail. Okay, if you have any questions about any of this, we can take those at the end, but hopefully you're letting this sink in a little bit and finding ways that you can tweak some of the things going on in your office. One last thing about this, what can we learn from this example? I'd say the phone is your friend still, as old-fashioned as it seems to some of us. Major grants mirror major donors in more ways than I think a lot of us want to admit. And finally, revisit your relationships. Don't try to build one and then let it fade into oblivion. Okay, conundrum number 3. What if we're offered a grant we can't refuse? Has anyone ever been in this situation? Grumbles. So this one is a little bit more of a cautionary tale, but it always feels like a responsibility of all of us in this field to talk about things like this, because increasingly there are many opportunities, especially when we're talking about the biggest gifts, to take something that does not align with your organization's priorities. And on some level, I think the best thing that grants professionals can do is to have some examples that we can provide to our leaders and remind ourselves of, so that we don't put ourselves in this situation. So it should not surprise you that this is a dark and scary costume that we're showing because it can mean some difficult times. So this is the example I will give you here was from a mid-sized organization that was a typical, if any of you from the local area will imagine the typical DC nonprofit, a lot of them do things that the rest of the world doesn't do as much in terms of advocacy, public education and awareness, that sort of basket of issues. And this organization had really relied on major donors, but was getting into the grant space and had also just modest success in grants. Well, I came on board and we started looking at major foundations. And lo and behold, the first one to come around was one that is important for all of us to be familiar with in its form, which is not the legacy foundations like Kellogg and Ford and all this, but these foundations that have living, breathing donors who sometimes and often get very involved in the grant seeking. I'm sorry, the grant making. Grant making. It'd be nice if they were involved in the grant seeking. So in this case, it was one of those amalgamations of a major donor and foundation kind of ask, right? Because this gentleman had a foundation. This was a tech mogul whose name you would all know. And he was very involved in this process. He summoned this nonprofit to come to him. Some of his tech friends had heard of its work. And so my job was to prep the CEO and Chief Development Officer for their meeting. So this was somebody who they were a little starstruck over, understandable. And again, we were very well prepped with what the organization planned to do and knew this donor's general interests, and we're very excited about possible synergies. But what we were all unprepared for, and these days I think we should all be prepared for this maybe in some realm, although this happened a number of years ago now, was that this funder just came into the meeting guns blazing and suggesting his own vision for what this organization should be doing. And it had nothing to do with advocacy, kind of was related to public education, but this organization that did it from Washington mostly on a national scale, utilizing people all over the country, said, well, what I want you to do is get a bus and travel around the country and do your advocacy and education by getting in touch directly with 1 million people and then getting their signatures on this form. And that'll be a great show of what we've done. So here's an office full of lawyers and public policy experts. What's an organization to do? No discussion, by the way, of overhead, which, when I finally brought it up, it was like, we're not talking about overhead with this guy because he's going to give us $1 million. So, I making light of this to some degree, but also have tremendous sympathy for what this means because I too have been in the shoes of all of us who've been in this situation. But this one was particularly stark to me in the way it was presented. So we come back to the office. We still did a lot of our listening, asked our questions, but it was clear he was not moving off of his idea. We went back to the office, and I can say, not from being prescient, but from having been an employee at an organization where we were involved in something like this before, I just said, look, we don't want anything to do with this. And to which the CEO said, well, did you hear him say that if we get this grant and we do a good job with it, he's going to introduce us to all his Silicon Valley friends? And I still just said, it's so hard, of course. You know the pressures these poor CEOs and development officers are under. We all know that. But let me just briefly tell you the sad, dark way that this unfolded, which was that the organization could not afford to hire other people to do this work because there was no overhead involved. They needed to keep the trains running, they thought, so they pulled all of their highly skilled people off of their program, sent them on the road, had no idea what this kind of program really meant. 1 million people is a lot of people. And so they ended up not being able to fulfill the million. I mean, it did do there was some great education work in there, but the point is, I think they definitely lost out on some opportunities for themselves. But because this funder was very data driven, if they didn't meet the benchmark, they didn't meet the benchmark, and that's how a lot of these grants unfortunately operate. So it goes without saying, they did not get the network, they did not get another grant, and it was really a very difficult lesson that I think we all have to go through to some degree at some point, but it is just good to know that once you're in this space where the seven-figure gifts are common, that we all really just have to watch out for the good of our organizations and our communities and our colleagues. So what is there to learn from that lesson? I think even though this particular grant was well within the mission of the organization, even mission can have its minefields. That's what I'd say about it. And that your capacity has a cap in it. There's a cap to your capacity, and finally, beware of being starstruck and out of luck. That happens a lot in this field, even when it's foundations. Yes?
Was financials or some sort of an attempt to redirect the funder to say, hey, this is maybe why this may not work, or these are the problems with your vision? If so, what was that? What feedback did you receive?
Yes, so the question is, was there an attempt to redirect the funder and get him on the same page as the organization? And yes, there was. He just thought he had a different idea for what might work. Right. So yes, it's not an easy puzzle. You know, I injected a little humor into it, but boy, it's a tough situation to be in, as many of us know. Okay, let's move on to something slightly more positive. Number 4. This one I have a feeling you can relate to. What if our excellent proposal makes little progress at a foundation? Is this a universal experience that we have all wondered about? And to illustrate this particular conundrum, we have not 1, not 2, but 3 characters, because this is probably what I've seen most often among so many nonprofits. We feel like we're putting together just the best proposal with so much preparation, and why is no one biting? Obviously, there are lots of reasons why a proposal might not be successful, and you all know most of those. But if I had to choose a reason that really was the most common, it would be illustrated by this example. And that was a particular client of mine who did its grant seeking with a team. The proposal would eventually make its way to the executive team. And whether you like that methodology or not, it had some very astute, smart people reading every document. And they all really took time to put effort into that proposal. So you had the grant professional, and you had VP of strategy and the COO, and you had the CEO looking at every proposal in depth. So I will say they were pretty good proposals. And they had submitted them to lots of these big funders whose names we all know, and not a bit of traction on any of them. So when I came in, of course, one of the first things I did was read through a stack of all of these recent proposals. And look, there's no way to just say, here's the reason you're not getting funded. But to me, in this case, and we did eventually see very positive results from what came of this, as I've seen at other groups, is that there was not a thread that ran through them all. And granted, did one funder see that whole stack of, say, 10 proposals? No. So you might think, well, what's the need for a thread? But to me, the thread is that you as an organization have a vision in mind, and each and every proposal you submit is leading to that vision. And this can be, the kind of vision that's printed on your website with the mission and that you review at strategic planning, but it can also be a vision for a particular niche in your programs. The bottom line is, what are you doing? Is what you're doing going to further additional work at your organization, additional work in the field? What is the through line that takes you to the end? Because, these big foundations, they don't give to the food bank. They want to give their grants to end hunger. And that's the mindset they have for everything. So this organization did a stellar job with every proposal as a standalone. But and granted, the grant seekers were not reading all of them, but you can imagine the difference if you take even one of those proposals and talk about not the food for the food bank, but this project's ability to help end hunger in our community, our country, or whatnot, and how it ties into everything else you're doing. In some of their examples, if they've already built a technical foundation to do something, and now they're going to leverage that to do the next thing, you want to mention this technical foundation we've already built and spent lots of money on and time, so that the current project they understand is not starting at ground zero. And that from here, it's going to go to this next place, whether it's scaling or just deepening knowledge, or it's going to be disseminated in some way. They need to know the entire through line. So again, as we talked about earlier, when we were thinking about that nonprofit resume, what are some things that you are saying now to funders that might matter a lot internally, that might not help them in seeing the vision? It really is, right now, a competition for who can help these foundations fulfill their visions the fastest. And I hate to say it, but the cheapest. They feel like they have limited dollars. And so we need to help them see what's happening before this grant, after this grant, and where it's all going. So with this organization, granted, this can be somewhat simple work or a very complex work, depending on your organization. Let's acknowledge that. But the idea that you are looking at the big picture needs to be a conversation that you're having regularly with the executive staff. And if you don't see the big picture, they need to help you see it. So we started having regular meetings or agenda items at this organization where pieces of their staff meetings talked about, here's where we're going, and here are all the projects that are taking us there. And that, as an agenda item, helped the grants folks, but really everybody, to start feeling like they had this streamlined effort to get to the end. And that seems a little bit obvious, maybe, but when you have to start putting that in writing and explaining it in 250 words or less, it's complicated. So it's really the start of a great organizational conversation to make sure that it's what you're doing, because certainly in my work, it's what I see the most often. And that we often, in the same way that in that media example, we'd have to take a few steps backwards and say, okay, let's spend a little time building credibility. It is definitely worth your time to make sure you're spending a little time on where we're going with all of this, to make sure that there are not some outlier initiatives we're trying to fund that we can't really make a solid case for as a whole. So this organization, I'm happy to say, with not an enormous amount of extra work, it really just took a few facilitated discussions to really solidify what they were thinking. We were able to put together in their existing proposals some language around this vision and how these different initiatives came together. And they went from having no funding from these foundations to they very quickly, because they were great at relationship building, so they already had contacts at these funders. So that shows you that they were really, the funders must have really been looking for something. And I really helped them try to take a first guess at where we might go, and the vision was it. And right away, from a very big funder whose names you would all know, they got $1.5 million for a regional pilot, and they went through that pilot, they had great results, and they got $3 million more from that same funder to expand the pilot. they got multiple other grants from other large funders, and seemingly we identified things fairly well for them, but they had already done a lot of great groundwork in relationship building. So that was a huge win and a reason to really up your game in terms of working with your team and being part of the strategy. You know, we hear increasingly that chief development officers and VPs for development should be at that strategy table, and I would hope that grants definitely has a strong seat there in that person or separately, because I think increasingly our jobs are not fully about writing. It really is about pulling these strategy pieces together, pushing others to make sure that there is a vision, and of course the relationship piece. So the place I think we all want to get to is one where we can feel confident that going to these big funders, you can pretty much guarantee that if you want to make an easier path of it for yourself, we'll add these 4 to the 6 more obvious things we talked about earlier: credibility, rapport, capacity, which was a nice way of saying avoid disaster, and context, putting your grant in context. I'd say that you can save a lot of time writing grants that won't get funded if you can make sure that your organization is focusing on these pieces. And what will that result in for you? Hopefully you will not have to hide your face. You can come out in public and do your thing. Thank you so much. I want to make sure we have a little bit of time for questions, but I will stay after and we'll be here throughout the day if anyone wants to talk further. Any questions? I sure will. Thanks. Yes?
So when you were talking about vision recently, did you have to help the organization revise their vision?
Yes, so the question is, did I, in these cases, have to help the organization revise the vision? In most cases, I think it's not always a matter of a formal revision in the way you'd think of it in a strategic plan. It's sometimes just almost a step down from that vision, which is where are we going with this current set of programs? So if our ultimate vision is to end hunger, if we are doing that for a particular region or in a particular sector with a particular niche in mind, it's often just about pulling that out of people. So sometimes it's a facilitated session that gets people thinking about where are all these programs taking us, and are these indeed sometimes all the programs that we want to be funding right now? Do they all lead to that same kind of vision? Yes, in the red?
I was really curious in your example about rapport, if that was an invitation-only funder, and if you can speak to how to develop a strategy for some that are invitation-only or some that have an open LOI process, and how you can, like, do you use that first before you try to make a call, or vice versa? Can you just talk a little bit about that?
I'm so glad you asked. I did mean to mention that that was a invitation-only funder, but the question was that an invitation-only funder in the example we gave about building rapport? And yes, it was. However, I have used that same type of system. I'd hate to call it a system, but being more methodical about relationship building and certainly being more persistent about it with all types of funders, and it works equally well just because building relationships is not a one-off, right? We all know that. So the question is, how can you cut through the noise of all of that these poor program officers have to deal with every day and really try to connect? But it does work equally well. We hate to discount the growing numbers of foundations that don't take unsolicited proposals. You can get in the door just as easily by building relationships. Yes?
On the question of persistence, when do you know it's time to give up? I mean, is it
That was a great question.
there are programs you just ain't never going to get. And
Yes.
Is it waiting for a no? Is it a question of time, like 18 months? Is it just a feeling that you have? What are some guidelines that you could give when you know maybe not to pursue that relationship and put your time and effort into something else?
I love it. The question was, when is it time to just give up? And I have to say that there have been, you get different signs from different groups. Sometimes you just get a gut. It's time to move on. But there have been program officers that I have tried for years to connect with who never wanted anything to do with the public, one-on-one back and forth. Fair. They probably have 30,000 people calling them every day. But I have left messages sometimes for those kinds of people that just say, it's Susan, I've submitted 5 grant proposals in the last 5 years. None of them have been accepted. I would love an indication of whether I should keep going. And I did get a call back. So it was again, I think the idea of a really brief, pointed message just does wonders for people who are inundated. And they probably appreciate, too, not having to be the bearer of bad news for the 6th time. So I feel like a brief email or phone message can be really compelling. And the phone message might be helpful if they can hear your tears in the background, and they might really call you back at that point. There are others? Yes.
Could you talk a little bit more about the foundations that do accept, let's say, open LOIs, and say very clearly on their websites and whatever else, the first contact is submit an LOI.
And so what do we do if the instructions on the website say first submit an LOI? Yes, you can do that. Sometimes I think it pays not to be a rules follower. They would probably hate to hear me say that. But I've also sometimes gone through that relationship building piece as I hit send on the LOI, so that it's in their hands, they can read it if they want, but if they don't want, here I am anyway to say hello, and I'll just say to them, I just submitted an LOI, but I'd love to talk to you. Of course, the advantage of talking before the LOI is that it could help you shape the LOI, or you really may not have a great sense of whether you're ready yet. So I think the best program officers are willing to have the conversation before the LOI just because you are voicing, briefly, the way in which you are torn. You've read their 990, you've read their website, you've talked maybe even to other grantees, but you're still unsure whether this is the right funder for you. I think sometimes that kind of honesty can get things moving, assuming that is the truth, and otherwise there might be another reason you need to chat. But yes, I have done it concurrently, and sometimes that has worked as well. It still can be a long process, though, I hate to say. Yes, in the gray?
What can you say that might help us with all of the funding coalitions that are happening? With all of the really big foundations, working with all the other really big foundations with a teeny amount of money. But, there's supposedly an initiative there, and, how do you do that? Maybe you know one, maybe you have a bad relationship with another, maybe, what do you do?
Yeah, so the question is, what do we do with these funding coalitions of big funders coming together with a fairly small amount of money to fund all of us in a given space? Great point. Ultimately, you want to find out, of course, who is in charge of that program and get to know that person. But if you happen to have a contact at any one of the participating foundations, that person might be able to plug you in. But you're right, it is tough because you're bringing together huge audiences into a small realm. So I think the good news about some of those is that those people are tending to get out a lot. So if you find out who's involved, and sometimes they are speaking places, you can hear them speak or find them on a streaming where you can learn a little more in depth. And I think hooking people with some knowledge that shows that you have done some homework on their work can be helpful. So I saw you stream live at the GPA conference, and I heard you say X. And I think sometimes that can be helpful in making your way into that for people for some reason, these kinds of groups tend to be a little more public, and I think that can be helpful. But otherwise, it really is the same kind of strategy, probably. How are we doing on time? Yeah, a couple more.
Actually, I already asked a question, but if you want to go ahead.
Oh, that's nice. Thanks. So who else? In the red?
So I research other organizations who are similar to ours, and I try to look for who is funding them. And in a lot of those cases, those funders are small family foundations. But so, for example, on foundations, it will say blah, blah, blah family foundation. There's no contact information. There's no website. And then
Right.
there's no way to contact them. So is that worth our trying to stalk them and try to find a contact? Or is that like technically they don't want to be contacted?
Yes, so family foundations admittedly are a different animal than the big ones we were talking about today, mostly because they're not staffed. And that's the main reason that it's a little harder to talk about them all in the same breath. They literally may be a family that is sitting at the Thanksgiving table making grant decisions. And so I'd be happy to talk to you about what that might look like after the session, but it is a little bit different than these groups that are well funded. We'll take one more and then, yes, in the purple.
The value of different relationships. Say, for example, at a college, the dean may know the executive director of a Black Foundation or even a trustee, but you have faculty who have relationships with, potential relationships with program officers. Are one and the other more fruitful? Has a program officer relationship potentially more fruitful than a leadership to leadership relationship?
That's a great question. The question was, is a program officer versus leadership relationship more fruitful? And mostly, I think it depends on the level of funding you're seeking. If you're seeking something really extraordinary in the way of funding for that funder, if, let's say, the average grant tends to be $500,000 and you're seeking $3 million, or whatever that math might turn out, certainly knowing the CEO is helpful if it's an outlier. If it's something a little bit outside of the guidelines, that CEO is better suited. So I think those are the instances where it can make a difference more than others. Thank you so much. You've been a terrific group. Thanks to all of you online for sticking with us, and happy to keep the conversation going.